Yoink. So, let's see, before we get started on material, I think the ankle and subtalar is the easiest of the lower extremity, because there's no merry-go-round spin. You know, the ankle doesn't rotate in the transverse plane. So everything will be linear sagittally and mostly frontally with the subtalar joint. So in other words, the hard stuff's done with, just going to take practice. But to give you a heads up on the outline going into your exam, we have Wednesday, which will do some practical examples of the ankle and subtalar, or identify muscle stretches. There's only one muscle that crosses the knee and ankle, and that's your gastrocnemius. So in terms of link tension, it's not a lot to have to remember. And then Friday will be a full-on practical, I like to say practical review. We can do examples, we can do, we can make it a lab day. Then Monday will be your review, Monday before the test. I am going to be out of town. I'm calling a veterans auction in Northern California. And so, driving. So, I know I'm taking a wagon, walking it across the Oregon Trail style. I've never told a charity no. So I'm going to be there. Grace, Emma are going to be here in person, but I'm going to be here like we did with my Zoom call. So in other words, I'll be able to answer questions, clarifications. And then Wednesday, my wife will be here to administer the test. But it's all, guys, y'all know what to expect. I mean, and I'm going to be available if there's any questions. Literally, this muscle's function is this, and it's the same stuff we've been doing. So I'm going to be available if there's any questions. I'm just going to be on the end of a phone. Hopefully, there won't be any problems. I don't think there's going to be any problems. I think the class average I'm anticipating is going to be in the mid-80s. I mean, that's just based off of previous classes and how I think you guys are doing. So, all right, let's get to it. So one of the things I want to remind you before we get into the muscles of the ankle and subtalar is that the ankle and subtalar joints are two separate joints that live in the same apartment complex. This is 310 review. So our circle, instead of an intersection, this is an overpass. In other words, you're looking down on a road that goes over a road underneath. So who's on top of what? The bilateral axis represents the ankle. You got those ankle bones? So that's on top. That's the overpass. Underneath it is the subtalar and transverse dorsal joints. In fact, subtalar. The talus is the bone that makes up the ankle, with the distal tibia fibula. So here's the talus. So this is ankle. And subtalar, underneath the talus, where the calcaneus lives, and the navicular, and the cuboid, and the cuneiforms, that's what gives us our wobble. That's what gives us our balance. In 310, I used the skateboard analogy. It's kind of an inverted skateboard, but it still holds. The wheels is what gives us our motion, and the wobble is what gives us our balance. So you have the wheel and the wobble. Those two things are not happening in the same place. So the wheel axis is our bilateral, and look on your chart, it says, hey guys, that bilateral axis represents the ankle. And so we know the ankle has two different forms of flexion, getting in the fetal while you're weight-bearing and getting into fetal when you're non-weight-bearing. Dorsiflexion is getting into fetal when your feet are on the ground, and plantar flexion is getting into fetal when your feet are off. If you wake up from a nap, you're probably not going to wake up in dorsiflexion. You're probably going to be plantar flex. But if you're standing, getting into a ball, you're going to be dorsiflex. So anterior muscles, anterior crossing muscles. You imagine if you went anterior and grabbed your shoestrings and pulled, you'd pull in the direction of dorsiflexion. So anterior crossing muscles are dorsiflexors. Posterior, it's like grabbing on to the heel of your shoe and pulling. You pull in the direction of the plantar. So posterior crossers or plantar flexors. And then we have the wobble, subtalar. Medial crossing muscles. Remember, this is a right circle. All of our appendicular circles are right-sided. Medial crossing muscles are inversion pullers, and lateral crossing muscles are eversion pullers. The easiest circle you have, because the only thing that's on an axis is your gastrocnemius and soleus, your big plantar flexors, which makes sense because they're pulling on the calcaneus. And calcaneus runs right back here. Versus the ones in the front can kind of go lateral, go medial, because the foot is in the front, so they can have a lateral medial cross. But for our soleus and gastroc, it's right on the axis. Here are for you listers. These are the muscles you're going to be accountable for. And as I go through them, like it's really not rocket science. Like tibialis anterior, a muscle on the anterior part of your leg that runs along the tibia. I'm going to teach you hallux means big toe, digits means 2, 3, 4, and 5, the little toes. So this is the piggy that went to market, and these are all the other. I'm going to teach you what perineal means, the difference between longus and brevis, it's tendon base. Soleus is Latin for solefish or flounder. Gastroc is Latin for head. So look, I kind of did a view. This is all on your Moodle, but I tried to, again, remind you of where our circles are coming from. So this is a way we can make a three-dimensional concept out of a two-dimensional picture. So here's our ankle axis. And so we have plantar and dorsi. So muscles that cross anterior are going to be dorsi, and muscles that cross posterior are going to be plantar. And then we have our anterior-posterior axis that runs, and it's kind of neat. It passes between our first and second ray, our first toe and middle and the second toe. So as you know, our big toe is kind of strong and powerful. So we have everything that crosses medial to here is going to be an inverter, and everything lateral here is going to be an inverter. And we don't have to worry about rotation. That's kind of cool. If your ankle, that doesn't mean you don't get rotational torque. It just means that if you have rotation, actual rotation of your talus inside its socket, it's a bad day. That's a high ankle. So we don't want that. So pretty linear. Should be a TikTok there. They still do those things. I'm always like 3 years behind trends. Permanently. All right, let's do some muscles. See what I want to say with this. I think what I wanted to show you with this picture is something we've said a lot of times about how function is not about so much origin insertion, but where it crosses. So I think I want to show you this picture where like you have these muscles, these perineals that cross and they keep going over to the medial side. But just because they're pulling on the medial side, they cross laterally. So they're actually taking the medial side and trying to draw it out. So we don't want to look at, oh, it inserts on the inside, so it must pull on the inside. It's where does it cross? So where does it cross? So I think that's why I had that to show you. All right, first sets of muscles, tibialis anterior and your extensor digitorum and extensor hallucis. All right, see how I can explain the tibialis anterior. All of these first muscles are dorsiflexors, dorsiflexors. Your tibialis anterior is the muscle that you feel if you dorsiflex and a muscle kind of lateral to your tibia. Your big bone kind of pops up right here. That's your tibialis anterior. Now, the tibialis anterior, once again, it starts laterally, but it comes across the foot and crosses on the inside, on the medial part. So in other words, it doesn't matter that it starts on the outside. It crosses the medial. It goes up under the foot. So therefore, it's going to have an inversion pull because it crosses onto the inside. Does that make sense? Tibialis anterior, front tibia muscle. Then you have these two, your toe extensors, basically. So you have these muscles that extend your toes. What I'm about to show you, I call bryomechanics, because I have I have a neuroma, and one of my former students, Nick Cart, who was my therapist for a long time, and he said, he was like, Campbell, these things are hard to treat. And I was like, I know. So over time, I've kind of developed some things that kind of help it. So what I want to show you is your toes, your big toe has its own string that pulls in the direction of extension and its own string that pulls in the direction of flexion. You have a big toe flexor and a big toe extensor. And we don't say big toe, we say fancy Latin word, hallux. So an extensor hallucis and a flexor hallucis. Thumb is pallix, but big toe is hallux. Now, if that muscle only pulled on the big toe, that would be one thing. But to get to the big toe, that muscle, extensor hallucis, look at that, crosses the ankle to get to the toe. So because it crosses the ankle to get to the big toe, that means when it pulls on the big toe, it's also going to pull the ankle. Does that make sense? In fact, it makes it more efficient to use your toes as dorsiflexors when you have shoes on, because now the toes can push on your toe box. That's why you have a toe box. So they can push on the toe box and then transfer that force into your ankle. Specifically during eccentrics, like when you heel strike and your dorsiflexors need to transition between heel strike and foot flat, that's eccentric loading. Eccentrics of the dorsiflexors, allowing the plantar flexors. Those toes are pushing on the shoe. Okay? So you have an extensor big toe. The dorsiflexion pull should be pretty obvious, but the inversion pull is the part that I want to point out. Just like the tibialis anterior, it also runs medial. Remember, I used that graphic to show you that since the anterior posterior axis for inversion and eversion wobble is between the first and second toe. So in other words, the big toe pull is going to pull the teeter-totter this way, and the four other digits are going to pull the teeter-totter that way in terms of inversion and eversion. So tibialis anterior, dorsiflexor at the ankle, inverter at the subtalar. Extensor hallucis longus, dorsiflexor at the ankle, inverter at the subtalar. Look, my little arrow clicker is showing you the axis for the subtalar gene in between the first and second rays. So that means if this is my axis, my AP axis for the inversion and eversion, then my extensor digits, you have one muscle. I mean, let's use verbiage you've heard of before. You've heard of toe off in gait? You ever heard that before? Heel strike, flat foot, toe off. You don't hear toes off, you hear toe off because your big toe. That's the last part you push off on. So in other words, your little toes, 2, 3, 4, and 5, it's not exactly dexterous. So in other words, they kind of all work together. You have one, you can even see it, you kind of have one muscle, and then down there it fans out into 4 strings. And when you pull on that one muscle, it's pulling on all 4 strings at the same time. Because you don't exactly have to have independent muscles for each toes to do You're not painting or writing. Okay, so extrinsically, you have this extensor digitorum that starts as one muscle and then fans out like Spider-Man web into the 4 other toes. This muscle crosses the ankle joint anteriorly, but remember, this is my AP axis. So all 4 of these digits are on the lateral side of the AP axis. So they're going to be everters, eversion pullers. Dorsiflexor everters. Let's look at how those 3 would sit in our circle. Tibialis anterior, dorsiflexor inverter. Extensor hallucis longus, dorsiflexor inverter. Extensor digitorum longus, dorsiflexor everter. Big toe, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Cool. All right, guys, now it's time to talk about the perineal cousins. Perineal cousins. You have a longus and a brevis, and then you have a tertius, potatoes and potato. The cousins are a family of perineals, lateral muscles. The longus and the brevis, we refer to those as sister muscles. Sister muscles, when you hear that in the clinic or in the field, mean 2 different muscles that have the same functions at a given articulation. That doesn't mean they have the same origins and insertions. There's usually differences in stability, because remember, muscles aren't just for movement, they are for stability. But in terms of the movement part, how they pull because of how they cross, they have the same crossings. So the longus and brevis, the peroneus longus and brevis are sister muscles. Then they have a cousin who has a similar function in the frontal plane, as you can probably see, crosses lateral, but has a different function in the sagittal plane. Does that make sense? And then I'm going to show you the muscle. Perineus. View of the tibialis anterior solo. There's a good view of my extensor big toe solo. Digitorum solo. And here's our perineus. So the peroneus tertius. You can see the anterior crossing. There's my bilateral axis of my ankle. So you can see the anterior crossing would be a dorsiflexion puller. Remember, seeing multi-dimensions is really hard in a static view. So it's easy to see the sagittal pull, but it's harder to see the frontal pull. Harder to see. I mean, we could kind of assume it's pulling laterally, but unless you see a front view to see how it crosses laterally. Okay. So that's the peroneus tertius. Okay, here's my longus, and then we're going to get into the brevis. So for longus and brevis muscles, the difference is tendon length, not muscle length. So it's kind of like inverted of what we think. We think a longus muscle is a long muscle, but a longus muscle is actually a long tendon, which means it has to be a short muscle. Like it has to turn into tendon soon so that the tendon could be the longest part of its influence. Does that make sense? So you'll see the longus and the brevis. So the longus turns into a tendon soon and has this big long tendon that wraps posteriorly. There's my bilateral axis. It goes from the back, comes all the way down, and inserts at the base of the first ray. Peroneus brevis has a shorter tendon. Look at that short tendon. So longer muscle, shorter tendon. And the brevis hooks on to the base of the fifth. This, you don't need to know this on the test, but in youth, there's injuries when you guys go off to school. Like there may be classes, or for me, I had a fellowship at Auburn from the Houston Clinic, and we looked at specifically, we emphasize youth injuries because there's growth plate issues with kiddos that we don't have. And that was one of the first things we learned, that when a kid has a sprained ankle, those tendons can sometimes be stronger than the bones they're pulling on. And so avulsion fractures, they call that a Jones fracture, but literally where this muscle reflexively yanks and pulls a piece of this bone off of growth plate fracture. This is another good example of potato. We have peroneus longus and brevis. Some books may have fibularis longus, fibularis brevis. I've seen some textbooks call the lateral collateral ligament the fibular collateral ligament. It's the same structure. It's just, some people call it different things. There's a lot of different languages out there. So if you're in grad school or if you're in public and someone calls something else, just go check it. Be like, oh yeah, they're talking about this. First time I heard someone call creatine creatinine, my head almost exploded. Like, oh, okay, makes sense. No. So let's look at our perineals one more time. Remember, it's all about how they cross. It's all about how they pull. Origins and insertions don't matter to me because that's just geography, and I have 3 months with you. They will matter eventually to some of you. Maybe you're like, well, Campbell, I understand we can isolate and do, but if I'm trying to do a manual muscle test, and that's where you might get into some palpation and, do a manual resistance and feel some of the origins and insertions, and it hurts right there. So that's not to dismiss that. It's just this is a 1-3 month class where I'm trying to give you as much functional knowledge as possible for when you take the next step. And so for me, I'm choosing functions of the muscles, how they pull, how we can lengthen them, understanding how they can work through different contractions to influence motion through contractions. And then the other stuff is just geography. That's the easy one. So look at what we've covered so far. Tibialis anterior, dorsiflexor inverter, extensor hallucis longus, dorsiflexor inverter, extensor digitorum longus, dorsiflexor everter, peroneus tertius, dorsiflexor everter, peroneus longus and brevis, sister muscles, plantar flexor everters. All right. So think about this. Again, this is what makes the ankle and subtalar joint so easy. God, it's so easy. Relative to the hip. Hip's crazy. We had a tibialis anterior. So we're going to have a tibialis posterior. We had an extensor hallucis longus. We're going to have a flexor hallucis longus. We had an extensor of the big toe. We're going to have a flexor of the big toe. We had extensors of the little toes. We're going to have flexors of the little toes. So in essence, we're just going to mirror those muscles. But unlike, I'm hoping this makes a little sense. So in the foot, the ankle joint is back here. We have a lot of surface area to kind of cross medial and lateral. But back here, we really have the option of this tunnel or that tunnel. You can either go lateral to the calcaneus or medial to the calcaneus. So the 3 muscles that I'm about to show you, the Tom, Dick, and Harry muscles. The tibialis posterior is Tom, Flexor digitorum longus is Dick, and flexor hallucis longus is Harry. Tom, Dick, and Harry is how we were taught. Those three strings run, let me get them right so that I can keep it consistent. Those three strings cross posteromedial, meaning posterior and medial. So in other words, they're running like this. In the back, it's going to give the plantar flexion pull, and medial to the subtalar is what's going to give the inversion. Some of you that are going to be therapists are going to really work gravity. Undefeated. Some of you are going to work really intently with the tibialis posterior. The tibialis posterior is the biggest contributor to arch support from a muscle perspective. You have other things that help contribute to arch support structurally. The way the dorsal bones are created, you have a ligament called the spring ligament up in here. You have a plantar fascia that try to help create a bow. But in terms of muscular support, the tibialis anterior is a big one. So for those of you that are going to be working with people with fallen arches or arch support, that's going to be a fun one. So let's take a look at these muscles. Tom, Dick, and Harry. Posteromedials. Tibialis posterior. There's my arch muscle. So again, here's a muscle that kind of looks like it's running laterally, but how does it cross? Crosses on the medials. That's why it's an invert. It has nothing to do with where it spends the majority of life. It's all about where does it cross. Can you see how if this crossed here, then it would be an evert. But it doesn't. It crosses on the inside, crosses on the medial side. So it's an inversion puller. The specific exercise, I know we talked about this in 310, but where you have inversion and eversion, but when you're weight bearing, you can invert when you supinate, and then you can evert when you pronate. So that tibialis anterior is really important. Invert because it helps create the arch, helps support your arch when you have inversion. I feel like a cyborg. All kinds of doohickeys and gizmos attached to my head. I don't want underground attached to the foot. All right, so it's an inverter. Can everybody see this is a back view, a posterior view? I mean, heck, we see the heel, we see the calcaneus. So it makes sense that it would be a plantar flexor, posteromedial plantar flexor inversion. Based off of what? Not origin insertion, but how it crosses. Simplest thing. How does it crawl? Okay, here's Dick. Flexor digitorum. Posteromedial. On the back of the ankle bones and on the medial side of the subtalar. And look, here it fans out and goes into the digits 2, 3, 4, and 5. And there's Harry. Flexor hallucis, posteromedial with his buddies, going to the big toe. Tom, Dick, and Harry. And actually, it's not on your test, but and actually stands for something artery and nerve. So when you're learning anatomy, they'll teach you that posteromedial quadrant. Tom, Dick, and Harry. The tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum longus, artery, the nerve, and flexor hallucis. There's all kinds of cool acronyms you guys are going to learn and that I forgot. So I don't need them. All right, guys, the last ones. Let's go back and review. So look at what we know so far. No rotation, no PE. Tibialis anterior, extensor hallucis longus, Tom, Dick, and Harry, those are inverters. Tibialis anterior, extensor hallucis longus, extensor digitorum longus, proneus tertius, those are dorsiflexors. Extensor digitorum longus, proneus tertius, proneus brevis, proneus longus, those are our everters. And then lastly, because again, there's no rotation, so really we just have 4 groups, 2 for ankle, 2 for subtalar. You have our plantar flexors, tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum longus, flexor hallucis longus, proneus brevis, and then finally the last 2, which are 2 you've probably heard of before, the soleus and the gastron. So if I told you that the wheel and the wobble, sorry, the wheel and the wobble, ankle and subtalar is like a skateboard, and you have the wheel and the wobble. The wobble doesn't, because it's kind of a first-class lever in terms of balance, it doesn't take a whole ton of force to sway to keep you balanced. Meaning, if you had a teeter-totter and it was already balanced, it doesn't take a lot of force to tip the scale. So when you're balancing, it's not like you have to have violent contractions of your inverters and everters. But to make the skateboard go, you have to have some significant force for your wheels, like to propel you forward. Balance, you don't have to have tremendous force to balance, but you have to have tremendous force or much more significant force to make you go. So we're going to talk about the wheel muscles, the muscles that get you going, the soleus and the gastron. And you can just, big difference. Look at that compared to all those other little nuanced muscles. Big gastrocnemius, big soleus. I mean, look at all these skinny little stringy muscles, and all of a sudden we get these big beefy calf muscles. That's for your wheels. That's for you to run, for you to jump. Okay? Not that those other muscles don't contribute, but you're not going to have a 40-inch vertical leap because your tibialis posterior is jacked up. Okay? Soleus and gastron. Here is some more material on link tension that I taught you the other day. It's just some different visuals. All right. So let's talk about the wheel muscles. Your gastrocnemius and your soleus cross the ankle posteriorly, and they attach to your calcaneus, and they cross pretty much straight. In other words, on the anterior-posterior axis. So in other words, not too lateral, not too medial in anatomical position, just posterior. Just posterior to the ankle. So that's why they're plantar flexion points. Another fun fact, if you remember on our first class, gastroc and soleus pull the heel up so that the toes push down. Remember the redirection of a force? We were talking about like pull the head down so your eyes look up. Gastrocnemius and the soleus form you guys know it as the Achilles tendon. In clinics, they'll refer to it as the triceps surae sometimes, if anybody's ever heard that. You have 2 heads of the gastroc, you have a medial and lateral head, and you have 1 head of the soleus, and they blend into one common tendon that cross the ankle. Call that the Achilles. The soleus is deep and the gastroc is superficial. Precedent for that, gluteus medius and minimus can piggyback on top. When we get into upper extremity, bicep, and brachialis piggybacking. So you have a piggyback effect. It's a pulley, so the gastroc can, hey, thanks for letting me get on top of you so I can have a little better angle. But for this class and this test, the important thing is that the gastroc is biaxial, meaning it crosses the ankle and the knee joint. You guys remember the gastroc for the knee, right? Crosses the knee posterior, so it's a knee flexor. Soleus doesn't. Soleus doesn't get anywhere near it. So here's our gastroc right here. You look at it crossing the knee posteriorly. We can't see the soleus because it's over the top. So we get the gastroc out of the way, and hey, we see the soleus, and it doesn't go anywhere near the knee. So length tension-wise, if we want to emphasize the gastrocnemius during a plantar flexor exercise, we want to make sure the knee is extended, so that way the gastroc is not on slack. But if we want to lessen the contribution of that big, powerful wheel muscle, we want to flex the knee so that the gastrocnemius gets put on slack, and the second most powerful wheel muscle can thus take up that slack, my soleus. But again, it's not like the other plantar flexors aren't contributing. Everybody that can pull in a direction of plantar flexion is contributing. It's just, we just looked at all those muscles and it's like, yeah, these are bigger. bigger, it's, when it comes to muscle, bigger is strong. So that's why the seated calf raise would work a soleus more, because the gastrocnemius is on slack. Now, I also want to talk about stretching. So important. If I'm trying to stretch at oh gosh, this might have been 15, 18 years ago. I had knee surgery, and while I was getting up out of the chair, I strained a muscle in my calf. And my therapist was a friend of mine who I went to Southern Miss with, Lisa Guillory. And she's awesome. And she was like, well, let's see if it's your gastroc or your soleus. And I think I was hopped up on meds. And I was like, how are we going to do that? And she was like, well, you know how the muscles cross and I was like, yeah, we learned that in school. She's like, well, she was like, so she did a stretch with my knee extended. And she was like, do you feel the pain? I was like, no, I don't. She's like, it's not your gastroc, but your gastroc is preventing me from dorsiflexing more and checking your soleus. So let's flex your knee. And then once I unlocked, or once I put my gastrocnemius on slack, she was able to get my dorsiflexion more. She was able to take me more into dorsiflexion because my gastroc was no longer my limiting factor. Does that make sense? And all of a sudden I was like, oh, I feel that. She's like, well, then you strained your soul. And I was like, that's so cool. Because I never felt it until then. So if you're trying to stretch a soleus muscle or other plantar flexors, you got to get that big gastroc out of the way. Gastrocnemia is big, powerful, strong, and also prone to tightness. So we want to make sure that knee is flexed, get that gastroc on slack so that we can get our ankle into more dorsiflexion and then stretch the other plantar flexors. But if my knee is extended and I'm trying to dorsiflex, my gastrocnemius might be my limiting factor. Make sense? All right, in the few minutes we have left, let's just do some practical examples. I mean, this is going to be bread and butter questions on your test, you guys. And then on Wednesday and Friday, we'll do more examples. But straight up questions you should be able to answer like clockwork. What are the two functions of the tibialis anterior? You should be able to tell me this. Dorsiflexor and invert. An ankle joint dorsiflexor and a subtalar joint invert. Does that high pulse? So in other words, I don't have to give you an example. Just how does this muscle pull at the ankle? Dorsiflexion. How does this muscle pull at the subtalar joint? Inversion pull. Now, if you forget that the ankle is not the subtalar joint, that's on you. That's a 310 thing, right? The ankle and subtalar are two separate things. What is the function of the peroneus tertius at the ankle? If I just ask at the ankle, it's either a dorsiflexor or a plantar flexor. So in this case, it'd be a dorsiflexor. What's the function of the tibialis posterior, the subtalar joint? I'm not asking about the ankle. It's an inverter at the subtalar joint. How would I want to stretch my extensor digitorum at the ankle? Well, they're dorsiflexors, so I want to try to plantar flex. And on Wednesday, we'll do some examples of toe drags, and there's other ways to try to stretch, dorsiflexors. But it's the concept. If it pulls this way, I need to move the joint the opposite way. Okay. Who are the subtalar joint everters? Well, those are my lateral crossing muscles. I have my extensor digitorum, I have my peroneus tertius, and my peroneus longus, and my peroneus brevis. Who are my ankle plantar flexors? My Tom, Dick, and Harry, tibialis posterior, flexor hallucis longus, flexor digitorum longus, soleus, gastroc, peroneus longus, peroneus brevis. Bang, 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 bang. And again, a lot of symmetry, but not all symmetrical, because in the posterior quadrants, it's almost like a waterfall. That heel bone, that calcaneus is so prominent. Those muscles have to either leak on the medial side or the lateral side. So they have to fit into grooves back there as opposed to the front that is a lot more free range. So that's why you have that Tom, Dick, and Harry on kind of that medial groove and the longus and brevis on that lateral. Any questions? So my suggestion is practice. Remember, the circles are just a tool to help us remember how things cross. This isn't meant for you to not look and learn the muscles. It's not meant for that at all. It's not meant to never look at the visuals of the muscles. It's just sometimes those visuals don't show us the multi-crossings. Oh, well, I can see how it crosses in the front, but I'm not quite sure if it's lateral. Our circles cement those crossings for us. They confirm those laterals, those anteriors, those posteriors, those anterolaterals. Because sometimes the two-dimensional pictures aren't obvious.
What are we going to have about the levers and pulleys on this?
That's also, I'm gonna fine tune that on Wednesday or Friday. Exactly what I want. Exactly what I want. Thank you for asking. The thing with levers and pulleys is that they're so nuanced. And so what I'm going to teach you on Wednesday is it's basically just what do you need is what you will use. And while I have a couple minutes, I want to plant this seed. Who's the fastest person to ever live on Earth? Usain Bolt. Usain Bolt can choose to run slow. I cannot choose to run fast. So to summarize, your leverage advantages, there's going to be some that are prone to speed. It's going to be great. We're going to have some Usain Bolt leverage. But when we're doing something heavy, that can't be done fast. If you're moving something heavy, it's going to go slow. So in other words, when you're doing something heavy, you want anything and everything to help you. Even if it doesn't have the leverage, any little bit can help move you. So all the things can help when you're moving something heavy, but when you're going fast, only the Usain Bolts can go fast. So I'm going to get into that. It's actually pretty simple, but it's all based off of what you need and the advantages you give. And I'm going to go over that. Like, for example, the rectus femoris at the knee is going to be an Usain Bolt, but the rectus femoris at the hip will be slow and strong. So we'll get into the muscles and kind of how they cross is going to give them certain advantages and disadvantages. But the trick is to say, well, if I'm doing something very heavy, it doesn't matter if I have a disadvantage. I need every muscle I could possibly use to help me. So I don't care if you're a second, a third, a first. Can you pull this way? I need your help. We'll do that also on Wednesday. All right, guys, you have a good one.